Joseph James DeAngelo. For over 40 years, the most dangerous man in California history was hiding in the one place nobody ever thinks to look: inside a uniform. He answered calls, he filed reports, he shook hands with frightened residents and told them they were safe. And every single time he clocked out and drove home, he became the very thing he had sworn to stop. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on the 8th of November, 1945, in Bath, New York. His early years were marked by instability and displacement, his family eventually relocating to California. He enrolled in the United States Navy in 1964 and served 4 years before attending Sierra College, where he graduated with honors in police science in 1970. He was educated, he was disciplined, he understood from the inside out exactly how investigators thought, how evidence was collected, and how crimes were solved. He used every bit of that knowledge not to protect the public, but to elude it. From 1973 to 1976, DeAngelo served as a police officer in Exeter, California. He then transferred to the Auburn Police Department, where he served until 1979. 2 jobs, 2 badges, a stellar reputation, and a secret that would not surface for another 4 decades. While stationed in Exeter, a phantom thief was working through the quiet neighborhoods of Visalia, California. Between 1974 and 1975, he committed over 120 break-ins across a tightly clustered geographic area. Investigators called him the Visalia Ransacker. He was precise, patient, and deeply studied, surveilling his targets long before he moved, sometimes rearranging small objects inside homes to test whether anyone was paying attention. Nobody on the task force could catch him. Nobody on the task force knew they were sitting next to him. By 1976, the crimes had shifted north to Sacramento, and they had grown far more grave. A masked intruder began entering homes at night, binding residents and terrorizing families across Sacramento and surrounding counties. Over the following 3 years, he struck a minimum of 51 times. He came to be known as the East Area Rapist. His approach carried all the signatures of a man with intimate knowledge of law enforcement procedure. He timed his movements carefully, wore gloves, avoided leaving traceable evidence, and studied his neighborhoods for weeks before acting. He made phone calls to victims before and after attacks, sometimes whispering threats in the middle of the night. He sent a poem called Excitement's Crave to the Sacramento Bee and to local authorities, openly mocking the investigation. He was not hiding, he was watching everyone search for him. Then, in December of 1979, the East Area Rapist went silent in Northern California. He did not stop, he relocated. In Southern California, a new series of crimes began appearing in case files. Unlike the East Area Rapist, this offender left no survivors. Couples were targeted in their homes in Goleta, Ventura, Dana Point, and Irvine. On the 30th of December 1979, Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were found dead in their Goleta home near Santa Barbara. In March of 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were discovered in their Ventura residence by Lyman's 12-year-old son. The crimes continued through 1986, claiming 13 lives in total. This offender became known as the original Night Stalker, and for years, nobody knew he and the East Area Rapist were the same person. It was not until 2001 that DNA analysis finally connected the 2 crime series. The profile was the same: one man, 51 attacks in Northern California, 13 lives taken in the South, over 120 burglaries before any of it began. California crime writer Michelle McNamara, who spent years of her life consumed by the case before her own death in 2016, gave him the name that history would remember him by: the Golden State Killer. In 2017, investigators made a decision that would change forensic science permanently. They uploaded a DNA profile constructed from decades-old evidence to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch. The profile matched no one directly, but it matched distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA in search of family history. Using a then emerging technique called investigative genetic genealogy, a team of researchers and genealogists spent 4 months constructing massive family trees, tracing branch after branch back through generations until 2 separate lines of descent converged on a single name: Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. Authorities placed him under surveillance. They retrieved a used tissue from his curbside trash and swabbed the door handle of a vehicle he had been using. Both samples matched the crime scene profile with certainty. It was him. After 40 years, it was him. On the 24th of April 2018, officers surrounded his house in the Sacramento suburb of Citrus Heights. DeAngelo stepped outside and found himself outnumbered and out of time. He offered no resistance. In a voice witnesses described as strangely small, he reportedly said, "I have a roast in the oven." He was 72 years old, living quietly in a suburb, with a granddaughter at home. He had been ordinary for decades, which was perhaps the most chilling fact of all. Alone in interrogation, he spoke to himself in a low whisper. "I did all that," he said. "I destroyed all those lives." He then described an inner alter ego he called Jerry, a part of himself he claimed was beyond his control. "I didn't have the strength to push him out," he said. On the 29th of June 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping and admitted to 161 additional uncharged crimes against 61 victims. That August, survivors and families confronted him in a Sacramento courtroom. One by one, they stood before him and spoke of what he had taken. He sat in a wheelchair, masked, and listened to every word. When it was his turn, he rose and addressed the room. "I've listened to all your statements," he said, "each one of them, and I am truly sorry to everyone I have hurt." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His case remains the landmark event in investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that has since been used to identify over 150 additional suspects nationwide. Joseph James DeAngelo spent decades believing that silence and time were enough to protect him. What he never understood was that his own DNA had been waiting patiently all along, ready to speak the one truth he never could. He is currently incarcerated in a California state correctional facility. He will die there.
Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Imagine a man who could attend a neighborhood barbecue, laugh with the family next door, wave at the children playing in the street, and then, by nightfall, become something no one on that block could have ever conceived of. Not a stranger, not a shadowy figure from another city. A neighbor, a husband, a father. A man so deeply embedded in the fabric of his own community that the very streets he hunted were the same streets where he was considered, by those who knew him, to be a good man. That is perhaps the most unsettling truth about Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Not merely what he did, but what he was able to be at the same time. Franklin was born on August 30th, 1952, and spent his entire life in the dense, sun-scorched neighborhoods of south-central Los Angeles. He grew up there. He stayed there. He married, raised 2 children, and worked as a sanitation worker for the city of Los Angeles in the 1980s, a job that gave him intimate, daily knowledge of the alleys, dumpsters, and forgotten corners of the very community he would later use as a dumping ground. He knew which alleyways were dark. He knew which ones were quiet. He had driven past them for years. And when the time came, that knowledge became something far more sinister than a working man's routine. But before Los Angeles, before the garbage trucks, before the marriage, there was a warning. In April of 1974, while stationed with the United States Army in Stuttgart, West Germany, Franklin and 2 other servicemen offered a 17-year-old girl a ride home. Once she was inside the vehicle, a knife appeared. What followed lasted through the night. He was convicted by a West German court and sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in prison. The United States Army subsequently gave him a dishonorable discharge in July of 1975. The pattern of luring, the habit of photographing his victims. Investigators would later say this assault in Germany was where that pattern began. The system knew, the record existed, and yet the world moved on, and Lonnie Franklin moved with it, back home to Los Angeles. The 1980s were a desperate period for South Central. The crack cocaine epidemic had taken hold with crushing force. Poverty deepened. Gang violence escalated. Police resources were strained and, critics would later argue, unevenly applied. It was during this climate that Franklin began targeting women, primarily young black women, many of whom were at fragile, vulnerable stages of their lives. His first confirmed victim was 29-year-old Deborah Jackson, whose body was found in a trash-strewn alley in August of 1985. She had been shot 3 times in the chest with a small-caliber handgun. She was a single mother of 3. She was left in an alley like refuse, and for years her case went cold. Over the next 3 years, more women disappeared or were found in similar conditions, in alleys, near dumpsters, partially clothed or unclothed, shot with what forensic analysis would later confirm was the same .25 caliber firearm. Barbara Ware, 23 years old, in January of 1987. Bernita Sparks, 26, in April of that same year. Georgia Mae Thomas, 27. Formally identified, quietly logged, and then absorbed into the noise of a city fighting too many fires at once. At the same time Franklin was operating, other dangerous men were active in the same neighborhoods, including the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. Their crimes overlapped in geography and era, and for a time detectives believed they might all be the work of a single offender they called the South Side Slayer. It would take years before law enforcement untangled those threads.
Then, in November of 1988, Franklin made the one mistake that would eventually unravel everything, though it would take more than 2 decades for anyone to fully realize it. He offered a ride to a 30-year-old woman named Initra Washington, who was walking to a friend's house. She was not a sex worker. She was a mother of 2 who accepted the ride because the man seemed ordinary. Inside his orange Ford Pinto, without warning, Washington was shot in the chest. She survived. She would later become the only known survivor of the Grim Sleeper, and when she took the stand at his trial, she told the court exactly who he was and what he had done. But in 1988, though she gave investigators a description, the trail went cold. And then, something strange happened. The killings appeared to stop. For approximately 13 years, there were no confirmed new crimes. Law enforcement, the public, and the press all moved on. His neighbors still saw him fixing cars in his driveway. His family still ate dinner with him. Whatever was happening inside Lonnie Franklin, the outside world saw only an ordinary, aging man in a modest house on West 81st Street. Then in 2002, a 15-year-old girl named Princess Berthomew was found in an alley in Inglewood. She had been strangled. And in 2007, the body of 25-year-old Janisha Peters was discovered, stuffed inside a plastic garbage bag inside a dumpster, shot with a .25 caliber weapon. DNA connected Peters to the earlier murders. The Grim Sleeper, a name coined by LA Weekly journalist Christine Pelisek in 2008, had returned. What finally brought Franklin down was a landmark moment in forensic history. California investigators ran DNA recovered from crime scenes through the state's felon database and found no direct match. So they did something that had rarely been done before at that scale. They searched for a familial match. The science looked not for an identical profile, but for DNA similar enough to suggest a close biological relative. That search led them to Franklin's son, Christopher, who had been arrested on a weapons charge in 2009. Christopher was too young to be the killer, but his father was exactly the right age. In July of 2010, an undercover detective posed as a busboy at a pizza restaurant where Franklin was celebrating a family birthday. The detective collected a half-eaten slice of pizza and other items from Franklin's table. The DNA extracted from that discarded slice was an exact match to the DNA found across multiple crime scenes spanning more than 2 decades. On July 7, 2010, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was arrested at his home. His trial began in February of 2016. Inside the courtroom, Franklin sat largely silent and expressionless throughout the proceedings. On May 5, 2016, after a day and a half of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on all 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On August 10, 2016, 31 years to the month after the death of his first confirmed victim, the Los Angeles Superior Court sentenced him to death. Emitra Washington, the woman he had left for dead in 1988, stood in that courtroom and addressed him directly. She told him he was a representative of pure evil and placed him in the company of Charles Manson. Inside Franklin's home, investigators had found over 1,000 photographs of women, many of them unconscious or unclothed, along with several hundred hours of video footage dating back 30 years. The LAPD released 180 of those photos publicly, hoping to identify possible additional victims. How many more women he harmed will never be fully known. When Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was found unresponsive in his cell at San Quentin State Prison on March 28, 2020, dead at the age of 67 from heart-related natural causes, he took that number with him. The families of his confirmed victims say that is perhaps the cruelest part, not that he died, but that he died without ever once, in any meaningful way, answering for the full scope of what he had done.
Albert DeSalvo. There's a particular kind of madness in a city that is afraid of its own doors. In the early 1960s, the women of Boston began doing something they had never felt the need to do before. They pushed furniture against their front doors at night, stopped answering knocks from strangers, and called out from windows before they would let anyone in. A city of nearly 700,000 people contracted in fear around a single question that nobody could answer. Who was getting through? Albert Henry DeSalvo was born on the 3rd of September 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, a small, gritty city just north of Boston. He grew up in a home defined by instability and deprivation. His father, a violent man, was arrested multiple times. DeSalvo witnessed things in his childhood that would take any psychologist years to fully chart. By the time he was a teenager, he already had a juvenile record. He enlisted in the United States Army and actually served with a degree of distinction. Honorably discharged after his first tour, he re-enlisted and eventually rose to the rank of military police sergeant with the 2nd Squadron, 14th Armored Cavalry Regiment. The Army gave him structure, but it did not change what was underneath. Back in civilian life, DeSalvo drifted into a pattern of disturbing behavior. In the late 1950s, he became known to Boston area police under 2 unusual aliases. As the Measuring Man, he knocked on the doors of women's apartments, introduced himself as a talent agency representative, and convinced some residents to allow him to take their measurements for a modeling campaign. It was a lie, but a sophisticated one, the kind built by someone who understood precisely how to make himself seem harmless. He was briefly arrested for that scheme and served a short sentence. Not long after, he began a more serious pattern of break-ins and assault across multiple states, earning himself the name the Green Man for the green work pants he wore during those attacks. He was arrested again in 1961 and convicted of assault and battery, receiving a suspended sentence. The courts, as they so often did in that era, let him walk. Between the 14th of June 1962 and the 4th of January 1964, 13 women were found dead in and around Boston. They ranged in age from 19 to 85. Most were found in their own apartments. Most had been strangled with articles of their own clothing, tied in a distinctive bow. The city called the killer the Boston Strangler. The press covered it with a fear they did not try to hide. The Boston Police Department transferred nearly its entire available resources toward the investigation. 5 separate district attorney offices were working the case across different counties, and still, the person responsible moved through the city like a shadow, invited in many cases, through his own persuasion. Then, in November of 1964, a 33-year-old handyman from Malden was arrested, not for murder, but for robbery and assault. His name was Albert DeSalvo. While being evaluated at Bridgewater State Hospital, he began talking. His fellow patient, a convicted killer named George Nasser, listened carefully and then called his attorney, the then rising criminal defense lawyer F. Lee Bailey. What DeSalvo told Bailey on tape was extraordinary. He claimed in meticulous detail that he was the Boston Strangler. He named the victims, he described the scenes. In some instances, he provided details that had never appeared in any newspaper, including one detail that had actually been recorded incorrectly in official police reports, which DeSalvo corrected. Investigators sat with him for hours. Slowly, some of them began to believe him, and yet he was never charged with a single one of those murders.
The legal path was complicated. Authorities could not physically place him at the crime scenes. Some witnesses shown his photograph did not recognize him. Several details in his confessions were wrong, including times of death and the positioning of certain victims.
Defense attorney Bailey argued that his client was too mentally unwell to be held criminally responsible. The result was a legal limbo. In 1967, DeSalvo was tried not for the Strangler killings, but for a separate series of rapes. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Then, in 1973, Albert DeSalvo recanted. He told people he had lied about being the Strangler. He was planning, according to people close to him, to make a new public statement. He never got the chance. On the 25th of November 1973, DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the infirmary of Walpole State Prison. He had been killed sometime overnight. A man named Robert Wilson, connected to the Winter Hill Gang, was tried for the killing, but the jury deadlocked. No one was ever convicted of DeSalvo's death. The secret, if he truly held one, went with him, or so it seemed. For decades, the case sat in contested territory. In 2001, initial DNA testing on evidence from victim Mary Sullivan actually appeared to exclude DeSalvo, casting new doubt over everything. Sullivan was 19 years old when she was found strangled in her Beacon Hill apartment on the 4th of January 1964, in what was believed to be the Strangler's final act. Her family, including her nephew Casey Sherman, had spent years publicly arguing that DeSalvo was not responsible. Then the science moved forward. Boston investigators, working with funding from the National Institute of Justice, took a different approach. They identified DeSalvo's living nephew, Tim DeSalvo, and placed him under quiet surveillance. At a construction site where Tim DeSalvo worked, a detective retrieved a water bottle the man had discarded. The Y chromosome DNA profile extracted from that bottle was compared against biological evidence preserved from Mary Sullivan's case. It matched. Investigators then did what the earlier testing had not. They exhumed Albert DeSalvo's body from Puritan Lawn Cemetery in Peabody, Massachusetts in July of 2013. They ran the comparison directly. The result was definitive. Prosecutors announced that the odds of the crime scene evidence belonging to any white male other than DeSalvo stood at 1 in 220 billion, a number so astronomically precise that it rendered reasonable doubt almost a philosophical concept rather than a legal one. On the 19th of July 2013, Suffolk County District Attorney Daniel Conley, Massachusetts Attorney General Martha Coakley, and Boston Police Commissioner Edward Davis stood before the press together. This leaves no doubt, Conley said, that Albert DeSalvo was responsible for the brutal murder of Mary Sullivan. He noted that the evidence linked DeSalvo definitively to that one killing, and that investigators now had to take seriously the possibility that he was responsible for the others he had confessed to as well. Albert DeSalvo confessed to 13 killings, was convicted of none of them, spent 6 years in prison on unrelated charges, and was dead before the science existed to prove what he claimed. His case is a study in the strange, uncomfortable intersections of truth and evidence, of what a justice system can do when a man confesses, and what it cannot do when the proof is not yet there. For the families of 13 women who never saw a courtroom day on their behalf, the 2013 announcement was not closure so much as confirmation of something they had been living inside for 50 years. The city of Boston had been right to be afraid, and the man who gave them every reason to be walked among them freely, knocked on their doors politely, and introduced himself like someone they had no reason to fear.
Richard Francis Cottingham. Every morning for 14 years, he made the same commute. He knotted his tie, kissed his children, walked out the front door of his modest suburban New Jersey home, and drove to his desk job in Manhattan, a reliable, well-regarded computer operator at Blue Cross Blue Shield, a man his supervisors considered dependable, a man his neighbors remembered as the quiet father who always took his kids trick-or-treating on Halloween. 14 years, 5 days a week, completely unremarkable. And the entire time, Richard Francis Cottingham was carrying a secret so vast, so deeply buried beneath the rhythms of ordinary life, that the people closest to him had not the faintest idea who was sitting across from them at dinner. Cottingham was born on November 25, 1946, in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the Bronx, New York. When he was 12, his family relocated to Rivervale, New Jersey, where he would spend the rest of his formative years in a tidy suburban township in Bergen County. His father was a senior executive at Metropolitan Life Insurance. His upbringing, by all visible measures, was stable. He graduated from Pascack Valley High School in Hillsdale, New Jersey in 1964 and followed his father into the insurance industry, first at Metropolitan Life and then from 1966 onward as a computer operator at Blue Cross Blue Shield on 3rd Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, the 3 to 11 shift. He married Janet Cunningham on May 3, 1970. They had 3 children, Blair, Scott, and Jenny. He coached, he commuted, he maintained the lawn. He was, to the naked eye, exactly the kind of man no one ever looks at twice. But inside the home, hidden behind a locked door that his wife and children were never permitted to enter, Cottingham kept a private room. Inside it, investigators would later find handcuffs, rope, prescription medications, and items taken from women who, by that point, were already gone. That locked room was perhaps the clearest symbol of everything Richard Cottingham was, a man who had partitioned his life so completely, so deliberately, that 2 entirely separate realities existed under one roof, and only he moved freely between them. How early did it begin? The answer is more disturbing than most people realize. Investigators and forensic historians who have spent years studying his case believe he began targeting women in his teens. His first officially confirmed victim was 29-year-old Nancy Shiava Vogel, a married mother of 2 who left her home one evening in 1967 to play bingo with friends at a local church in New Jersey. She never came home. Her body was found 3 days later in her car in Ridgefield Park, bound and strangled. Cottingham did not confess to her murder until 2010. For more than 4 decades, her family had no answer. He had been 17 years into a respectable career, 3 years into a marriage, and a father of 2 by the time he finally said the words aloud. Through the late 1960s and across the 1970s, women disappeared or were discovered in parking lots, in motel rooms, in vehicles along the roadways of New York and New Jersey. In 1968 alone, Cottingham killed 3 teenage girls, 13-year-old Jackie Harp, 15-year-old Denise Velasca, and 18-year-old Irene Blaze. None of those cases were solved for decades. In April of 1974, 17-year-old Mary Ann Pryor and 16-year-old Lorraine Kelly were abducted near a shopping mall in Paramus. Their bodies were found in a parking lot. Cottingham would not confess to those murders until April of 2021, 47 years after the fact. His method was consistent and deliberate. He chose the 3 to 11 shift at work precisely because it gave him the late-night hours he needed. After clocking out of his office on 3rd Avenue, he would move through the bars and streets of Times Square, an area that in the 1970s was a sprawling, neon-lit corridor of desperation and transactional existence, targeting women who were alone and vulnerable.
He was charming in the way that the most dangerous people often are. Attentive, generous with money, generous with time. He would buy drinks, talk about his house in the suburbs, offer to help. And then when the right moment arrived, the mask came fully off. The crime that stamped his name in press history occurred in the early morning hours of December 2nd, 1979. Firefighters responding to an alarm at a hotel near Times Square forced their way into a room and found 2 women. Both had been killed. Both had been dismembered. Their heads and hands had been removed and were never recovered. One victim was identified as 22-year-old Dide Gadarzi, an immigrant from Kuwait who had come to the United States as a teenager and ended up working the streets of Manhattan. Her daughter, given up for adoption years earlier, would one day sit across from Cottingham in a New Jersey prison and look into the face of the man who had taken her mother from her. The other woman in that hotel room has never been identified. She remains a Jane Doe to this day. From these crimes, the press gave him a name, the Torso Killer. His arrest came not through any investigative breakthrough, but through a motel employee's instinct on the morning of May 22, 1980. Cottingham had checked into the Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, with 18-year-old Leslie Ann Odell. When a staff member heard a woman screaming from inside the room and alerted police, officers arrived to find Cottingham being physically confronted by Odell. He was arrested on the spot, shirtless with a bag in the room containing handcuffs, knives, and prescription drugs. Odell survived and became a key witness. Staggeringly, Cottingham had checked into the same Quality Inn, the very same motel where just 18 days earlier he had left the body of 19-year-old Vattery Ann Street stuffed under the bed. Nobody on staff had recognized him. At trial, he was convicted of multiple murders and assaults across separate proceedings in New Jersey and New York between 1981 and 1984. The sentences were consecutive, totaling at minimum 173 to 197 years. He would never leave prison. And yet, for the families of women who had vanished across the metropolitan area over the prior 15 years, the convictions answered almost nothing. Beginning in 2004, Bergen County Detective Robert Anzalotti began visiting Cottingham in prison. Over the course of approximately 100 sessions across 17 years, Anzalotti built something resembling rapport, not friendship, but enough of a transactional relationship that Cottingham, by degrees, began to talk. He confessed to the 1967 murder of Nancy Vogel in 2010. He admitted to the 1974 double homicide of Marianne Pryor and Lorraine Kelly in April of 2021, weeks before Anzalotti's retirement. And then came the moment that forensic science had been building toward for more than half a century. In 2022, DNA extracted from evidence preserved since 1968, evidence collected long before the science existed to properly analyze it, returned an exact match to Richard Cottingham in the case of Diane Cusick. Cusick had been a dance teacher and mother of one who stopped at Green Acres Mall in Valley Stream, Long Island, in February of 1968 to buy a pair of shoes and never came home. Investigators believed Cottingham had posed as a security guard, falsely accused her of shoplifting, and used that pretense to separate her from the public. The DNA match in her case was confirmed as the oldest forensic DNA identification ever to result in a prosecution in United States history. On December 5, 2022, appearing by video link from his prison hospital bed at Southwood State Prison in Bridgeton, New Jersey, Cottingham pleaded guilty to her murder. He also admitted to 4 additional Nassau County killings from the early 1970s. Darlene Altman, Diane Cusick's daughter who had been 4 years old when her mother went out to buy dance shoes, was in that courtroom. She watched his face on the screen. Richard Cottingham has claimed responsibility for as many as 100 homicides. Authorities have formally linked him to roughly 20. He is now in his late 70s, incarcerated and in poor health. He has never publicly expressed remorse in any meaningful or sustained way. According to those who have spent years in conversation with him, he regards his confessions not as relief, but as leverage, given on his timeline, at his discretion, one at a time. Somewhere in New York and New Jersey, there are families still waiting for a name, still waiting for a date, still waiting for a locked room inside one man's mind to finally open. Terry Rasmussen. Some people disappear because they are running from something. Terry Rasmussen disappeared because he needed everyone around him to disappear too. He moved through America's back roads with quiet ease, collecting names the way other people collect debts. Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, Jerry Mockerman, Gordon Jensen, each alias a fresh start, each fresh start leaving behind a trail of women and children who were never seen alive again. For decades, not a single person in law enforcement knew who he truly was. Not his victims' families, not the detectives assigned to the barrels they found in the woods, not even the prison that held him when he finally died. He took his real name and several secrets all the way into the ground. Terry Peter Rasmussen was born in 1943. He would live for 67 years, spending large stretches of that time drifting across New Hampshire, California, Arizona, Texas, Oregon, and Virginia, reinventing himself wherever he landed. Those who encountered him briefly described a man who could seem personable and unremarkable, the kind of person no one would think to remember. That ordinariness was not incidental. It was the method, and it worked for a very long time.
In November of 1978, a young woman named Marlise Honeychurch was last seen in California. She had recently introduced her family to a new companion, a man going by the name Terry Rasmussen. After that introduction, Marlise and her two young daughters, Marie Vaughn and Sarah McWaters, vanished completely. No distress calls, no forwarding address, no trace. Her family spent years wondering. Friends moved on. Investigators had nothing to work with, and the man she had last been seen with simply relocated. Then, on the 17th of November 1985, a hunter walking through a wooded property near Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, made a discovery that would set off one of the longest forensic investigations in American history. He found a metal barrel. Inside were the remains of a woman and a young girl. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s. The girl was estimated to be between 6 and 11 years old. There were no identification documents, no jewelry with inscriptions, no way to connect the remains to anyone, anywhere. New Hampshire State Police opened a case and ran into a wall that would not move for over 30 years. 15 years later, in the spring of 2000, a second barrel was found just 300 feet from the first. Inside were the remains of two more young girls, toddlers, investigators estimated. 4 people, 2 barrels, 1 stretch of woods, and still no names. Elsewhere in America, a man going by the name Robert Evans was arrested in California in the early 1990s for theft and served a short sentence. Later, under the name Curtis Kimball, he was arrested again, this time for the murder of his girlfriend, Yoon Soon Jun, a chemist whose remains were found at their California home in 2002. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years. In prison, he was interviewed by detectives. He said almost nothing useful. On the 28th of December 2010, he died at High Desert State Prison from lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and pneumonia. He was 67 years old. He was buried, still legally unidentified, still carrying his aliases. For 6 years after his death, the connection between this man and the barrels in New Hampshire existed nowhere except in what he had refused to say. The turning point came in 2017 through a forensic technique that had barely existed a decade earlier. Genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, working with New Hampshire investigators, used the DNA recovered from the Bear Brook victims alongside an emerging method called investigative genetic genealogy. She built family trees through partial DNA matches in public databases, tracing branches until they converged on a real person. The man known as Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, and Robert Evans was confirmed through Y chromosome DNA testing contributed by one of his children from a believed first marriage to be Terry Peter Rasmussen. It was the first time in American history that genetic genealogy had been used to identify a criminal suspect. The technique that would later unmask the Golden State Killer was born from the effort to name this man. But identifying the killer was only half the work. The 4 women and children in the barrels still had no names. In October of 2018, New Hampshire Public Radio released a podcast called Bear Brook, documenting the long mystery. A 34-year-old librarian from Connecticut named Becky Heath listened to it and became consumed. In her evenings after work, she scoured ancestry websites and online forums, cross-referencing ages, disappearances, and family structures. She found a post on Ancestry.com from 1999, a young man searching for his missing half-sister, Sarah. The ages and descriptions aligned. Heath contacted the family. A name surfaced, Rasmussen, the same surname that had attached itself to the man in the barrels and the man who died in California. Heath submitted her findings to law enforcement in October of 2018. Simultaneously, Ray Venter was doing the same work through DNA alone. Working with degraded genetic material recovered from the victim's hair strands, using a then pioneering method to reassemble broken autosomal DNA, she built a genealogical profile for the adult woman and the 2 biologically related girls. The 2 threads, Heath's research and Ray Venter's DNA work, arrived at the same place within weeks of each other.
In June of 2019, New Hampshire authorities announced that 3 of the 4 Bear Brook victims had been formally identified. The adult woman was Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. Her daughters were Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters. They had last been seen in California in November of 1978, the last time anyone outside of Terry Rasmussen had laid eyes on them. One victim remained unnamed. The child investigators had come to call the middle child, estimated to be between 2 and 4 years old when she died, was not biologically related to the Honeychurch family. DNA confirmed she was Rasmussen's own daughter. Her mother was identified as a woman named Pepper Reed, born in 1952 in Texas, last seen in the late 1970s. Reed has not been found. Investigators believe she too may have been a victim of Rasmussen. That investigation remains active. The middle child's identity was finally confirmed on the 5th of September 2025 when the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit and the DNA Doe Project announced that she was Rhea Rasmussen, born in 1976 in Orange County, California, to Terry Rasmussen and Pepper Reed. She was between 2 and 4 years old when she died. There are no known photographs of her. The DNA Doe Project built a genealogical tree of approximately 25,000 names to reach her. The process took 18 months. It required tracing her ancestry back to relatives born in the 1780s. Criminologist Jack Levin, speaking about Rasmussen, once noted that what distinguished him from most serial offenders was that he targeted people with whom he already had a relationship. He was not a stranger in the dark. He was the man at the dinner table, the man being introduced to the family, the man no one thought to suspect because he was already inside the circle of trust before anyone knew what he was. Terry Rasmussen was never tried for the Bear Brook murders. He died in prison, convicted only of the killing of Eun Soon Jun, never knowing, or perhaps never caring, that science would eventually do what his silence tried to prevent. One by one, across 4 decades, the names he erased were given back. Marlise, Marie, Sarah, Rhea. Each one found again, not by a confession, not by a witness, but by the only language that cannot be coached or changed or hidden behind an alias. In the end, the truth was written in biology, and it waited as long as it needed to. Kenneth Gould, January 2nd, 1956. Somewhere in the frozen flatlands of Great Falls, Montana, 2 young people who had spent the earlier hours of that evening sharing a meal at Pete's Drive-In restaurant and dreaming about the rest of their lives together were instead running out of time. They did not know it. Nobody did. The families of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky would go to bed that night, assuming the young couple had perhaps eloped, because that was the kind of love story those 2 seemed to be writing. What the families could not have known, and what an entire community could not have foreseen, was that the real ending to that story would not be revealed for 65 years. And when it finally was, it would rewrite the history of forensic science in the United States forever. Lloyd Dwayne Bogle was 18 years old, a United States Air Force airman stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls, originally from Waco, Texas. By all accounts, the moment he arrived in Montana and met Patricia Kalitsky, a 16-year-old junior at Great Falls High School, something in him simply settled. Detective Sergeant John Cadner of the Cascade County Sheriff's Office, who would spend years immersed in the details of this case, described Bogle as having been instantly captivated by her. Patricia, Patty to those who knew her, was bright and well-liked among her classmates, the kind of person whose presence registered in a room. The 2 were young, full of forward momentum, and on the evening of January 2nd, they were simply out on a date. They were last seen together just after 9 o'clock that night, leaving Pete's Drive-In. From there, the evidence suggests they drove to a stretch of road near Wadsworth Park, west of Great Falls, a spot that was known, in the quiet social geography of the area, as a place where young couples would park and talk beneath the Montana sky. They never came home. The following morning, January 3rd, 3 boys out hiking near the Sun River made a discovery that would shake the entire community. They found Bogle's car with the engine still running, the headlights still on, and the radio still playing, as though time had simply stopped. Bogle himself was found face down near the vehicle, his hands bound behind his back with his own belt. He had been shot in the head. A day later, a county road worker found Patricia Kalitsky's body north of Great Falls. She too had been shot in the head. The killer had left almost nothing behind. Almost. During the autopsy performed on Kalitsky, a coroner took a standard vaginal swab and carefully preserved it on a microscopic slide. At the time, that slide went into a vault. The science needed to speak its truth did not yet exist. The world would have to wait. Investigators in the months and years that followed chased down every credible lead the case could generate. Over the course of the next several decades, nearly 36 suspects were investigated and ultimately cleared. Among them, astonishingly, was the notorious Boston crime figure James Whitey Bulger, who had been charged with a separate assault in Great Falls approximately 5 years before the murders. Each lead, in the end, dissolved into nothing. Kenneth Gould's name never appeared in the case file at all. He was never questioned. He was, in the language of the investigation, completely invisible. And yet, in 1956, Gould was a 29-year-old Great Falls resident living just over a mile from where Patty Kalitsky had grown up. He worked corralling horses in the area and kept those horses at a location roughly 600 yards from her childhood home. He had married a 16-year-old girl in 1952. He had 5 children. And a little over a month after the murders of Bogle and Kalitsky, he sold his family's property and moved them away from Great Falls. He drifted between Montana towns for a period, then crossed state lines entirely, eventually settling in Alton, Missouri in 1967, where he would spend the rest of his life as an ordinary man in a small town, a husband, a father, a neighbor, carrying a secret that, as far as he knew, would follow him quietly into the ground.
In 2001, now retired Detective Phil Madison sent that preserved autopsy slide from 1956 to the Montana State Crime Lab. Technicians examining the sample found a single sperm cell that did not belong to Lloyd Bogle. A DNA profile was constructed. When that profile was run against the National Criminal Database, the CODIS system, no match came back. Gould had no criminal record. He had never been arrested. He was simply not in the system. Madison retired without resolution. He said plainly that he did not believe the case would ever be solved. Then, in 2018, everything changed, not in Montana, but in California. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo, identified as the Golden State Killer through a then novel technique called forensic genealogy, demonstrated to law enforcement agencies across the country that a DNA profile could be uploaded to publicly available genealogical databases, matched against the profiles of distant relatives, and used to construct a family tree that worked backward and then forward to the probable source. Detective Sergeant John Cadner, who had been assigned the Bogle-Kalitsky case in 2012, watched what happened in California and immediately began to ask a single question. Could the same approach work on evidence that was now more than 60 years old? In 2019, Cadner partnered with Bode Technology, a Virginia-based firm specializing in advanced DNA analysis. Their scientists extracted a new DNA profile from that same 63-year-old evidence sample, uploaded it to genealogical databases, and began the patient, painstaking work of building a family tree from the biological data outward. The process identified 3 individuals genetically compatible with the sample. One of them was Kenneth Gould. Gould had died on May 31, 2007, in Oregon County, Missouri, at the age of 79. He had been cremated. There was no body, no biological material, no direct way to compare his DNA to the evidence. The only path forward ran through his children. Cadner made the calls. He reached out to Gould's surviving children and asked them to voluntarily provide DNA samples so that investigators could either confirm or eliminate their father as a suspect in a double homicide from 65 years earlier. He later described not knowing how they would receive that conversation. What he found instead were people willing to cooperate, people who seemed to understand the weight of what was being asked and chose to meet it honestly. 3 of Gould's children submitted samples. The results confirmed the biological connection. The DNA preserved from Patricia Kalitsky's 1956 autopsy matched the genetic profile of Kenneth Gould's children. One of his daughters, when told the results, reportedly told Cadner that her father had always seemed to carry something unspoken within him.
That some people, she said, simply have secrets they never tell anyone. Because Gould died before the case was resolved, and because no direct DNA comparison to his own remains was possible, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office stopped short of declaring him the definitive perpetrator in absolute legal terms. The official language used by the office and by Cascade County Sheriff Jesse Slaughter was that Gould was the most likely suspect. That is the ceiling that death imposes on justice. There is no trial, there is no conviction. There is only the evidence, the science, the family tree, and the geography of a man who lived a mile from a girl he may have encountered on the road one January night and who was gone from Montana within weeks of her death. On June 8, 2021, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office stood before the public and announced that the 65-year-old case of Patricia Kalitsky and Lloyd Dwayne Bogle had been resolved. Detective Sergeant Cadner confirmed that this was, to the best of his and any national expert's knowledge, the oldest criminal case in the United States ever solved through forensic genealogy. Kalitsky's sister, by then elderly and living with advanced dementia, could not fully absorb the news. Bogle's brother had died in 2013, never having learned what happened to Lloyd on that January night. Bogle's sister-in-law told investigators that not knowing had affected the family throughout their entire lives, that it had lived inside them as a permanent, unresolved wound. For the families of two young people who had simply gone out on a date on the second evening of a new year, 65 years had passed before the name of the man responsible was finally spoken aloud.
Harry Edward Greenwell. He sold vegetables at the farmer's market on weekends. He tended an organic garden. He followed college sports, read widely, and was remembered by neighbors as generous and warm. When he died in January of 2013 in the small town of Lansing, Iowa, the people who gathered to mourn him grieved the man they thought they had known, a retired railroad worker who had finally found a quiet life. What none of them knew, what the rest of America would not learn for another 9 years, was that the man in that casket had spent a stretch of the late 1980s moving up and down one of the country's most traveled interstate highways, leaving behind 3 women who never made it home from work. Harry Edward Greenwell was born on the 9th of December 1944 in Kentucky. His early record reads like a ledger of recklessness and defiance. His first arrest came on the 17th of January 1963, armed robbery. He was paroled from the Kentucky State Penitentiary in 1969. In 1978, his wife died in a house fire in Wisconsin, and he remarried within a little over a year. By 1982, he had been arrested again for robbery in Iowa, escaped from custody, was recaptured, escaped again, was recaptured a second time, and eventually served his sentence at the Anamosa State Penitentiary and the Kentucky State Reformatory before being released in 1983. At some point in the years that followed, he found steady work as a railroad employee, riding tracks across the Midwest with a familiarity that gave him a practical, ever-shifting map of the region. He knew the exits, he knew the motels, he knew exactly where a man could stop without anyone expecting him back. The first killing that investigators would eventually connect to his name occurred in the early hours of the 21st of February 1987 at a Super 8 motel just off Interstate 65 in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. A guest called police to report that the lobby appeared ransacked, a telephone ripped from the wall, signs of a disturbance. The night shift clerk, 41-year-old Vicky Heath, was missing. Vicky was a mother of 2 who had recently become engaged. Her body was found behind a dumpster in the motel parking lot. She had been assaulted, robbed, and shot twice in the head with a .38 caliber firearm. There were no witnesses, no name, nothing but DNA evidence carefully collected and preserved, which would sit in a laboratory for 35 years waiting for science to catch up. 2 years passed. Then, on the 3rd of March 1989, 2 women were killed on the same day at 2 separate motels along the same highway, 53 miles apart. Jean Gilbert, 33 years old, was working the night desk at a Days Inn in Remington, Indiana. She was reported missing after her shift, and her body was later found in a ditch near the motel.
That same night, 24-year-old Margaret Gill, known to friends as Peggy, was found dead at a Days Inn in Merrillville, Indiana. Both women had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber firearm. Both had been assaulted and robbed. Ballistic evidence linked the Gill and Gilbert murders to each other. DNA evidence connected them to Vicky Heath's case. The same man, the same stretch of highway. 3 women, 3 night shifts, no survivors. On the 2nd of January 1990, he struck again, this time at a Days Inn in Columbus, Indiana. The clerk on duty that night was 21 years old. She was assaulted and stabbed, but she survived, and when detectives sat with her afterward, she gave them something the previous scenes had never yielded, a description. White male, approximately 6 feet tall, green eyes, a lazy right eye, grayish-brown hair, flannel shirt, blue jeans. A composite sketch was produced and circulated. Investigators named the unknown offender the I-65 killer, sometimes the Days Inn killer, and began working outward along the highway's geography. In 1990, Elizabethtown police matched DNA from the Heath case to at least 4 other crime scenes across multiple states, all motels, all night clerks, all along I-65. In 1991, a woman in Rochester, Minnesota survived a similar attack and gave a description nearly identical to the Columbus survivor's account. The cases were building a portrait of a man who knew this corridor the way a person knows their own street.
And yet, he was never caught. He kept working the railroad. He tended his garden, he attended farmers markets, and sold his produce to neighbors who thought well of him. In February of 2010, he retired from the Canadian Pacific Railway. Not long after, he was diagnosed with cancer. He died in January of 2013. He was 68 years old. The cold case formally reopened in 2008, when DNA from the crime scenes was resubmitted using updated technology. In 2010, the Kentucky State Police officially announced that the 3 murders were linked and that investigators were dealing with a single offender. 9 more years passed. Then, in 2019, Indiana State Police requested the direct assistance of the FBI's Gang Response Investigative Team, the same unit that had developed expertise in investigative genealogical genetics, the technique that had identified the Golden State Killer the previous year. The process involved uploading the crime scene DNA profile to public genealogy databases, identifying partial genetic matches, and constructing detailed family trees reaching back through generations until a single candidate emerged. The DNA matched a close family member of Greenwell's. From there, the Indiana State Police Laboratory ran a direct comparison. The results came back at 99.9999% probability, a figure that left no scientific room for ambiguity. On the 5th of April, 2022, Indiana State Police, the FBI, and the Elizabethtown Police Department stood together at a press conference in Indianapolis and named him publicly for the first time: Harry Edward Greenwell. He had been dead for 9 years. Indiana State Police Superintendent Douglas Carter addressed the families of the victims directly that day. "I hope that today might bring a little bit of solace to you," he said, "to know that the animal who did this is no longer on this earth." He declined to say Greenwell's name again. Kim Gilbert Wright, an attorney and the daughter of victim Jean Gilbert, thanked the investigators and the genealogists whose painstaking work had made the identification possible, but she was measured about what that day actually meant. "Some will believe the identity of the killer proves and provides justice," she said. "Others will see justice as the moment a killer is convicted in a court of law." Greenwell had robbed them of that too, of a trial, of testimony, of a reckoning in public. He had taken 3 women and then simply outlived the investigation by 9 years. What made his case particularly striking to criminologists was not just the length of time it took to solve, but the studied normalcy of the life he built around his crimes. He was not visibly unraveling. He was not isolated or strange. He was a neighbor, a gardener, a man at the market. The families of the women who worked those night shifts along I-65 never got the verdict they deserved, but they got the name. And investigators, as of the announcement in 2022, confirmed they were actively examining whether other unsolved crimes along the full length of Interstate 65, from Gary, Indiana, all the way south to Mobile, Alabama, might one day be added to his account. The answer to that question remains open. What is no longer open is who he was.
Gene Meyer. The morning of November 6, 1988, began the same way it always did for Betty Rolfe. She rose early in her home on the 1300 block of West Spencer Street in the town of Grand Chute, Wisconsin, just outside Appleton, put on her coat against the cold, and set out on foot for work. She had done this walk dozens of times, a short route of under a mile to the Country Air banquet room on West Spencer Street, where she worked doing laundry. She was 60 years old, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a woman whose neighbors and family described as warm and good-natured, a person the world simply would have continued to go on needing. She feared black ice more than she feared people, which is why she preferred to walk to work in winter rather than drive. On that particular morning in November, that preference cost her her life. Betty Rolfe never arrived at work. When she failed to show up, her family contacted police. The next day, on November 7th, her body was discovered underneath the Spencer Street Bridge, behind a concrete abutment near the railroad tracks, a hidden pocket beneath a public structure, out of sight from the road above. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled with her own purse straps. The contents of her opened purse were scattered nearby. Among them, investigators found $30 in cash that had not been taken, and a letter she had been planning to submit to the local newspaper about her and her husband's upcoming wedding anniversary. Gene Clarence Meyer, at the age of 32, had ripped a woman from an early morning walk to work and left her beneath a bridge. He had then, in the days that followed, done something that in retrospect becomes one of the most telling details of this entire case. He packed up and left Wisconsin entirely. To understand the 34 years that followed, one has to understand what DNA technology looked like in 1988. Investigators at the crime scene collected biological evidence from Rolfe's body, including vaginal swabs during her autopsy. The Wisconsin Crime Lab preserved those samples carefully, but in 1988, the lab did not yet have the ability to conduct DNA testing in the way we understand it today. What they could do was rely on older forensic methods, serological typing, and microscopic comparison, which were useful but could not produce the kind of individual genetic profile that would eventually make this case possible. The biological evidence sat preserved in storage, holding the answer to a question the science of that era simply could not yet ask properly. Betty Rolfe's case went cold. Her family buried their grief alongside their uncertainty and waited for a world that did not yet exist. Gene Meyer, meanwhile, had crossed into Washington State, where he would spend the next 3.5 decades living in Eatonville, a small rural community in Pierce County at the base of Mount Rainier. He had a valid Washington State driver's license. He had a criminal history through the state of Washington, but nothing that placed him in any national DNA database, nothing that would have generated an automatic hit when investigators eventually entered the unknown suspect profile from Betty Rolfe's case into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA index system. Year after year, Outagamie County investigators periodically revisited the case, submitted the stored evidence as DNA technology advanced, and came back with the same result each time. No match, no name, nothing. What had never been attempted, at least not in this case, was a familial search. By 2019, the forensic genealogy revolution triggered by the arrest of the Golden State Killer the previous year had begun reshaping the landscape of cold case investigation across the country. Law enforcement agencies were coming to understand that even without a direct CODIS match, a DNA profile could be uploaded to publicly available genealogical databases, databases populated largely by ordinary people tracing their ancestry, and searched for partial matches suggesting a biological relative. From those relatives, a family tree could be constructed and narrowed until it pointed toward a specific individual. In February of 2022, the Outagamie County Sheriff's Office, working in collaboration with the FBI, submitted the preserved forensic evidence to Othram, a private forensic laboratory based in the Woodlands, Texas, that specializes in what it calls forensic-grade genome sequencing, a method capable of building comprehensive DNA profiles from degraded or minimal biological material. Othram scientists completed the analysis and delivered a new, detailed DNA profile to the FBI's forensic genealogical team.
From that profile, investigators constructed a family tree that led them to two men who existed within the correct genetic lineage, Gene Meyer and his brother. Investigators contacted the brother, who cooperated willingly and provided a DNA sample. He was excluded. That left one name. Investigator Sergeant Fitzpatrick of the Outagamie County Sheriff's Office then contacted the FBI field office in Olympia, Washington, and requested that federal agents place Gene Meyer under surveillance for the purpose of obtaining a DNA sample without his knowledge or cooperation. On November 21, 2022, FBI agents assigned to the surveillance operation were able to swab the door handle of Meyer's Dodge Ram pickup truck. Those swabs were sent to the Wisconsin Crime Lab. When analysts compared the DNA profile obtained from that door handle to the unknown suspect profile developed from the evidence preserved during Betty Rolfe's 1988 autopsy, the result was definitive. The likelihood ratio calculated for the comparison was greater than 1 quadrillion to 1. It was him. It had always been him. On December 6, 2022, 34 years and 1 month after Betty Rolfe's body was found beneath that bridge, Gene Meyer was charged with first-degree intentional homicide and first-degree sexual assault in Outagamie County Circuit Court. He was arrested by the Pierce County Sheriff's Department in Washington and held in the Pierce County Jail in Tacoma while awaiting extradition to Wisconsin. He was 66 years old. He had been living his quiet rural life, driving his truck, with no apparent awareness that the forensic world had spent decades quietly advancing toward him. Meyer's trial began in the Outagamie County Circuit Court on May 13, 2024, nearly 36 years after the crime. He did not take the stand. His defense attorney argued, in opening statements, that Rolfe had actually been killed by her husband, a claim the prosecution countered by presenting evidence that Rolfe's husband's DNA was not found on her body and that investigators had ruled him out as a suspect years earlier. On Tuesday, May 21, 2024, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on both counts. Meyer sat in the courtroom and showed no visible emotion. He rarely moved his gaze from the judge's bench. District Attorney Melinda Tempelis noted during the sentencing hearing that Betty Rolfe had been a complete stranger to Gene Meyer. He had attacked her in what Tempelis described as a sexually motivated crime against a woman he had never met and who had simply been walking to work on a winter morning. The amount of anger and cruelty directed at a person so entirely unknown to him, Tempelis told the court, was something she described as incomprehensible to the average human mind. On July 11, 2024, Outagamie County Circuit Court Judge Mark Schroeder sentenced Gene Meyer to life in prison plus 20 years. He ruled that Meyer would be eligible for parole after 34 years, a figure prosecutors had specifically requested because it mirrored the length of time that had passed between the crime and the arrest. Judge Schroeder observed plainly that Meyer would more than likely spend whatever remained of his life incarcerated. After the sentencing, Rolfe's daughter, Sheila Worm, stepped out of the courtroom in a T-shirt bearing her mother's photograph and the words, "Justice for Betty." She told reporters that her family could finally rest. What those 3 words cannot fully carry is the weight of 36 years of an open wound, 36 years of holidays, of family gatherings, of a grandmother's chair left empty, and a question that for all that time, no one could answer. The answer had existed all along, preserved on a microscope slide in a crime lab in Wisconsin, waiting for the science and the will to catch up with one man who had simply walked away.